The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not through a soldier, not through a warship pointing guns at Earth. It came through a simple diplomatic channel. A cold, formal document stamped with the golden seal of the Vrethkai Senate. It was delivered to the office of Ambassador Sarah Vance at exactly 0900 hours, and the man who handed it to her didn't even wait for a response. He just turned around and walked back to his shuttle. Sarah held the document in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. She had been humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Ascendancy for 11 years. In that time, she had sat through 1,000 boring Senate sessions. She had shaken hands, or the alien equivalent of it, with dozens of species. She had smiled politely when Vrethkai senators talked down to her. She had learned how to keep her face calm, even when her stomach was turning. But when she read the first 3 lines of that letter, her hands went cold. The document was called the Tithe Decree. It was 12 pages long, and written in the dry, emotionless language that the Vrethkai Senate used for everything. But the meaning was simple enough. Humanity had been a member of the Galactic Ascendancy for 80 years. For 80 years, the Ascendancy had provided what they called civilizational protection, military presence, trade access, and galactic recognition. And now, the Senate had decided it was time to collect payment. The bill was enormous. It listed rare minerals from 3 of Earth's colony worlds. It listed 2 fully terraformed planets that humans had spent 60 years building. It listed control of 17 hyperlane routes that human ships use every day. And at the bottom of the list, in the same calm official language as everything else, it listed 1.2 billion human workers to be transferred to Ascendancy labor programs for a period of no less than 30 years. Sarah read that last part twice, then a third time. She sat very still for almost a minute. Then she picked up her communication device and called Earth. The Vrethkai were an old species. They had been ruling the galaxy, or their large corner of it, for over 4,000 years. In that time, they had absorbed 61 civilizations into the Ascendancy. Some had joined willingly. Most had not. But all of them, eventually, had paid their tithes and taken their place in the order of things. The Vrethkai did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as managers. The galaxy was a resource, and resources needed to be organized. Younger species needed structure, and they needed to understand, clearly and early, where they stood in the hierarchy. Humanity had always been a small concern to them. Interesting, perhaps, in the way that a stray animal is interesting, unpredictable, a little odd, occasionally clever, but not dangerous. Earth was a single world, with colonies on a handful of nearby planets. Humans had fewer than 200 registered warships in Ascendancy records. They were loud and emotional, and they asked too many questions in Senate sessions. But they were small, and small things paid when they were told to pay. Senator Vral Keth, the head of the Tithe Committee, had personally reviewed the Terran file before signing the decree. He had found nothing alarming. Humans had been quiet for 80 years. They would be quiet for 80 more. He expected an answer within a week. A protest, probably. Some noise. And then, like every other species before them, they would sign the payment agreement, and the matter would be closed. The news reached Earth 6 hours after Sarah made her call. It spread fast. By the evening, every screen on every continent was carrying the story. News presenters read the terms of the Tithe Decree out loud in dozens of languages. People stood in their kitchens and their offices and their streets and listened. Some were angry immediately. Some were confused. Some sat in silence, trying to process what they had just heard. 1.2 billion people, as labor, for 30 years. There were protests before midnight. By morning, they were in every major city on Earth, and a dozen colony worlds. The footage was everywhere. People in the streets, in the cold, holding lights and signs and each other. The noise of it traveled all the way to the Ascendancy's relay stations, picked up by 1,000 monitoring systems. The Vrethkai analysts flagged it as expected emotional response. Nothing unusual. No military activity. No movement of ships. They noted that humanity had gone quiet. Officially quiet. After the initial noise. No formal response from the Terran Union. No counteroffer. No request for negotiation. Just silence. Senator Vralketh was not concerned. Silence was normal. Species always needed time to accept the inevitable. He gave them 72 hours. Sarah Vance did not sleep during those 72 hours. She sat in her office on the Ascendancy's capital station and answered calls. Call after call from Earth, from colony governors, from military commanders, from scientists and engineers and ordinary people who had somehow gotten her contact number. She listened to all of them. She was waiting. On the morning of the third day, the call she had been waiting for finally came. It was from the Terran Union Emergency Council. The session had lasted 14 hours. She already knew what they were going to tell her, but she listened to every word anyway. The vote had been unanimous. She thanked them, closed the call, and sat for a while longer in the quiet of her office. Through the window, she could see the massive towers of the Ascendancy capital gleaming in the light of a distant star. Beautiful, she thought. The way an old trap was beautiful, if you looked at it the right way. She picked up her pen and pulled a blank sheet of official Terran Union paper from her drawer. She did not use the standard diplomatic template. She did not use legal language or careful phrasing. She wrote it herself, in plain words, the way she had been raised to say things. It took her less than 10 minutes. She folded the paper, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to Senator Vralketh of the Vrethkai Senate, chair of the Tithe Committee. Then she called her aide and told him to have it delivered immediately. She watched the aide walk out of her office. She leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes. Outside, somewhere across the vast and sleeping galaxy, things were already moving. Ships were waking up. Foundries were lighting their furnaces. Admirals were pulling on their uniforms and reading their orders for the first time. The 72 hours were up. The letter reached Senator Vralketh on a Wednesday morning. His aide placed it on his desk without a word. The senator noticed it was not typed. It was handwritten on plain white paper, in the small and slightly uneven way that humans wrote when they were doing it themselves, rather than using a machine. He found that strange. Every formal document he had ever received from a species under the Ascendancy had been properly formatted, properly sealed, properly terrified. He opened it. It was one paragraph long. It said, "The Terran Union does not recognize the Tithe Decree. We do not owe the Galactic Ascendancy anything. We were told the Compact of Induction was an agreement between equals. We have since learned what your definition of equal means. We are done negotiating. Consider this our formal response." It was signed by Ambassador Sarah Vance on behalf of the Terran Union Emergency Council. Then he set it down very carefully on his desk, as if it might be contagious. He called his senior advisor. His senior advisor called the military committee. The military committee chairman actually laughed when he heard the contents. He laughed for a full 10 seconds, which was unusual for a Vrethkai, since they were not naturally a laughing species. "Humans," the chairman said, still smiling. "What do they have? 200 ships?" 187 registered, the advisor confirmed. "Send a Punisher fleet," the chairman said. "Burn one of their outer colonies, something small. That will settle the matter quickly." Nobody in the room disagreed. Nobody thought twice. On Earth, things were moving very fast. Admiral Dren Cassidy had been retired for 4 years. He lived in a house near the coast in the south of Ireland, and he spent most of his days walking along the water and trying not to think about the decades he had spent in uniform. He had fought in the Fringe Wars, the longest and ugliest conflict humanity had ever been involved in, a grinding, brutal campaign against pirates and raiders on the edge of human-controlled space. He had won. It had cost him a lot. He was sitting outside with a cup of tea when his communication device buzzed with a Priority 1 signal from the Terran Union Defense Command. He looked at the device for a moment, then he picked it up. By that evening he was in a black transport shuttle heading toward Geneva. The emergency council briefing lasted 3 hours. They showed him everything: the tithe decree, the vote, the letters Sarah Vance had sent, and then, the part that even Cassidy had not fully known until that day, they showed him the numbers. Not the 187 ships in the Ascendancy's records, the real numbers. For 60 years, quietly and carefully, buried under civilian shipping manifests and mining operations and deep space construction projects, the Terran Union had been building. Not because they expected war, but because some people in the right offices had always felt, in the back of their minds, that the compact of induction was too good a deal for it to actually be free. The Shadow Fleet was enormous. Thousands of vessels, warships, carriers, supply ships, drone platforms, hidden in asteroid belts, in the deep dark between planets, in sealed bays beneath the surface of the moon. Most of the crews had been training in silence for years, running simulations, preparing for orders they were never sure would come. Now the orders had come. Cassidy looked at the full inventory for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at the council. "What's my authority?" he asked. "Total," said the council chairman. "You are commander of the Terran Expeditionary Force. You answer to this council and nobody else." Cassidy nodded once. "Then I need a shipyard, a full logistics team, and someone to get me a sandwich. I haven't eaten since this morning." The first thing Cassidy did was not what anyone expected. He did not move the Shadow Fleet. He did not start launching ships toward Vrethkai space. He called every shipyard commander on Earth and in the colonies and gave them a single order: start converting. Civilian freighters became transport ships. Cargo platforms became mobile supply stations. Mining vessels were stripped and refitted with weapon systems that the engineering teams had been designing in secret for years. Every factory that could be redirected to weapons production was redirected within 72 hours. The Ascendancy had never bothered to look closely at human industry. They had seen Earth as a small, quiet, slightly backward world, with a modest fleet and no real appetite for conflict. What they had missed, what they had never thought to look for, was that humanity had one of the most flexible and fast-moving industrial bases in the known galaxy. When humans decided to build something, they built it fast, in large numbers, and they kept building until the job was done. Within 3 weeks, the TEF had a fleet that would have made the Vrethkai Military Committee stop laughing. But Cassidy kept it hidden. He kept the ships dark, running on minimal power, tucked away in their hiding places. The enemy would make the first move. He wanted to let them. He was right about that. The Vrethkai Punisher fleet left port on a Friday. 40 dreadnoughts, each one larger than most human space stations. Their target was Callaway Station, a human colony on the far edge of settled space, home to about 900,000 people. The Vrethkai chose it because it was isolated, lightly defended according to their records, and far enough from Earth that the damage would be visible without being too complicated. They expected to arrive, make a show of force, demand surrender, accept it, take whatever resources were available, and transmit the footage back to the Senate as proof that the matter was being handled. The fleet commander, Admiral Sketvron, had done this twice before with other species. It was never difficult. Species that tried to refuse payment always changed their minds once they saw 40 dreadnoughts come out of faster-than-light travel in their home system. His fleet jumped on schedule. The transit took 9 hours. When they dropped back into normal space at the edge of the Callaway system, everything looked exactly as expected. Callaway Station was visible in the distance. The system was quiet. Sketvron sat back in his command chair. He gave the order to begin the standard approach pattern. The system stayed quiet for exactly 4 minutes. Then the first human ships appeared on his screens, not from the direction of the station, but from behind, from the asteroid field on his port side, and from the dark space above and below the ecliptic. Hundreds of them. His sensor officer said something that translated roughly as, "Those are not in any ascendancy registry, sir." The admiral reached for his communication panel to call for backup. He did not get the chance. The Battle of Callaway lasted 5 hours and 53 minutes. That was all. 40 Vrethkai dreadnoughts, each one a warship that had never been seriously threatened in its entire operational life, entered the Callaway system with the comfortable confidence of a species that had never really lost a fight. They left with 9 ships. The other 31 were destroyed, disabled, or adrift. Admiral Sketvaron was not among the 9 that escaped. His flagship took 3 direct strikes in the first hour and broke apart in the middle of the engagement. He never understood what hit him, or how, or why his tactical systems could not track the human ships properly. They moved in ways that did not make sense. They did not form battle lines. They did not follow any combat pattern that existed in the Ascendancy's extensive library of recorded warfare. They came from every direction at once. They did not act like a fleet. They acted like a swarm. The drone platforms came first. Hundreds of unmanned ships that flooded the sensor systems of the dreadnoughts with so much noise and movement that the targeting computers could not decide what was real and what was not. By the time the Vrethkai gunners figured out which contacts to shoot at, real human warships were already inside the minimum engagement range of the big guns. At close range, the dreadnought's size stopped being an advantage. The human ships were smaller and faster, and they had been built for exactly this kind of fight. They hit the dreadnoughts in their weak points, the engine sections, the power relay junctions, the spots where the armor was thinnest. Every human commander had studied the publicly available technical records of Vrethkai warship construction. The Ascendancy had never thought to classify that information, because no species in their records had ever needed to use it against them. That oversight cost them 31 ships. Commander Alette Durin, who led the Callaway engagement from her ship, the Unbroken, filed her after-action report within 6 hours of the battle's end. She described the engagement in flat, professional language. She noted the weapon systems that worked well, the ones that needed adjustment, the timing errors in the drone deployment sequence, and the fuel consumption rates that would need to be accounted for in future operations. She did not write about how she had felt standing on the bridge of her ship as the last Vrethkai dreadnought went dark. She was not the kind of person who wrote about feelings in official reports. But later, in a private message to Admiral Cassidy, she wrote 4 words: "They had no idea." The footage reached the Ascendancy capital in 36 hours. It spread faster than that. The Vrethkai tried to contain it. They flagged the sensor recordings as classified, ordered their media networks to hold the story, and called an emergency session of the military committee. But information in a galaxy full of different species and communication networks was very hard to bottle up. And within 2 days the footage of the Battle of Callaway was being watched on screens across dozens of worlds. Not just by humans. The Fenari saw it. The Fenari were a species of tall, thin bipeds with gray skin and very large dark eyes, who had been part of the Ascendancy for 160 years. They had paid their tithes. They had given their labor. They had done everything the Vrethkai had asked of them, because they had seen what happened to species that did not. A Fenari elder named Sorvon Tel watched the Battle of Callaway footage 3 times in a row. She watched the drone swarm hit the Vrethkai sensors. She watched the human ships close in fast from every direction. She watched 31 dreadnoughts go dark in under 6 hours. She turned to the young aide sitting beside her and said, very quietly, "They fought back." The aide looked at the screen. "The humans?" "They fought back," Sorvantel said again, as if she was still getting used to the sound of the words. The Dulo Collective saw it too. So did the Osean nomads. So did 7 other species who had been inside the Ascendancy long enough to know exactly what the Tithe Decree really meant, and to have quietly accepted, long ago, that there was nothing to be done about it. They all watched the footage. They all thought their own thoughts. And some of them started making quiet, careful communications to each other. On the Vrethkai homeworld, the Senate met in emergency session. The meeting was not calm. For 4,000 years, the Ascendancy had operated on a simple principle. Size and history meant dominance. The Vrethkai had the largest fleet in the known galaxy. They had the oldest institutions. They had fought and won 100 conflicts. No species inside their borders had ever launched a successful military operation against them. Until 5 days ago. Senator Vral Keth sat in his seat and listened to the military committee chairman explain what had happened at Callaway. He listened to the part about the sensor jamming. He listened to the part about the unregistered fleet. He listened to the part about the human tactical patterns that matched nothing in their databases. He listened to all of it with an expression on his face that, for a Vrethkai, was unusual. He looked worried. "How many ships do the humans actually have?" he asked. That hesitation told Vral Keth everything. "We're still assessing," the chairman said. "You don't know," Vral Keth said. "We are in the process of—" "You don't know," Vral Keth said again, quietly. "We sent 40 dreadnoughts to collect a debt from a species we thought had less than 200 ships, and they were waiting for us." Nobody in the room said anything. "They were waiting for us," he repeated. "Which means they planned for this. Which means they have been planning for this." He paused. "For how long?" More silence. He looked around the table at the most powerful figures in the Ascendancy government. Senior senators, military commanders, intelligence directors, all of them looking at their hands, or the table, or somewhere that was not his face. "Send a second fleet," the military chairman said eventually. "Larger this time. 100 dreadnoughts, full combat configuration. We hit their home system directly. Earth itself. That will end this quickly." Some heads nodded. The logic was familiar. Escalate. Overwhelm. Close the matter. Vral Keth said nothing. He looked at the table. Something was sitting in the back of his mind that he could not quite name. It felt like the very early stage of a realization, the moment just before you understand that you have made a serious mistake. He could not yet see the full shape of it, but it was there. Outside the Senate chamber, across the stars, Admiral Cassidy was reading Commander Duran's after-action report for the second time. He circled 2 items with a red pen. Then he picked up his communication device and called his senior planning team. "Callaway was a test," he told them. "They'll come back with more, bigger, and they'll come straight for Earth." He leaned back in his chair. "So let's talk about what's waiting for them when they get there." The war entered its 2nd month, and the Vrethkai were already confused. They had expected a defensive war. A species that had surprised them once, yes, but a small species. One that would pull its ships together around Earth and its colonies and try to hold on while the Ascendancy assembled a force too large to stop. That was the pattern. Every species fought that way in the end. You protect what you love. You cluster your forces. You wait for the inevitable. Humanity did not do that. Admiral Cassidy had no interest in a defensive war. He had fought the fringe wars, and the one lesson he had carried out of that decade-long nightmare was simple. If you wait for the enemy to come to you, you give them all the time they need to get ready. The only way to fight a much bigger enemy was to make sure they were always too busy dealing with fires to plan their next move. He called it Operation Headstone. The idea was not to destroy the Vrethkai fleet in one great battle. That was not possible, not yet. The Ascendancy had thousands of warships across dozens of systems. Humanity could not match that number in open combat. But the Ascendancy was also an empire, and empires ran on systems. Supply lines, communication relays, administrative hubs, resource depots, the machines that kept a 4,000-year-old bureaucracy functioning every single day. Cassidy targeted the machines. Small, fast strike teams hit hyperlane relay stations, the communication towers that allowed the Ascendancy to coordinate across hundreds of light-years, and went dark again before any response force could arrive. Supply depots on the outer edges of Vrethkai territory were raided or destroyed, cutting off fuel and ammunition to fleet units in those regions. Administrative stations that processed tithes and labor transfers from subject species were disabled one by one, quietly and efficiently. None of these were glorious battles. None of them would make history books on their own. But together, they created a problem that the Vrethkai Senate had never had to deal with in 4,000 years. Things were not working. Ships that should have received resupply orders received nothing. Battle groups that should have been coordinating found their communication lines dead. Regional governors sent urgent messages to the capital that vanished into broken relay networks and were never answered. The bureaucratic machine of the Ascendancy, ancient, massive, and accustomed to running perfectly, began to grind. Bree, HR. Meanwhile, Ambassador Sarah Vance was not on Earth. She had boarded a small, fast, unregistered ship 3 weeks after the Battle of Callaway and made a journey that was not in any official record. She traveled to a system in the outer edges of Ascendancy space where nobody was supposed to be watching, and she met with a woman she had spoken to only once before, a Thanari elder named Sorvan Tel. Bree. The meeting took place on a neutral station, in a room with no recording devices. Vance brought 2 aides. Sorvan Tel brought 3 advisors. They sat across a plain table from each other, and talked for 6 hours. The conversation was careful at first. There was a long history of caution between species who had all learned, in their own way, that trust inside the Ascendancy could get you killed. She did not come with demands or ultimatums. She came with a question. What do you want? Sorvan Tel had a long list. So did the representatives of the Dulo Collective and the Osean Nomads, who were brought in by secure communication as the meeting progressed. And the more they talked, the more they found that what they all wanted was, at its core, the same thing. An end to being treated like a resource. An end to tithes and labor quotas and the endless grinding experience of being owned. By the end of those 6 hours, Vance had the beginning of something. She called it the Pact of Free Stars. It was not a military alliance at first. It was simpler than that. A shared agreement that none of them would interfere with each other's resistance, and that information would be shared when it mattered. But in the following weeks, as Operation Headstone continued to weaken Ascendancy infrastructure, the pact grew. The Thanari began quietly refusing certain labor orders. The Duo Collective started sharing Ascendancy fleet movement data with Cassidy's planning teams. The Osean Nomads, who had the best network of smugglers and independent traders in the galaxy, began moving supplies and people in ways the Ascendancy could no longer track properly, because half their relay network was offline. The war doubled in scope, almost without a single new battle being fought. On the Vrethkai homeworld, Senator Vral Keth stood in front of the Senate for the second emergency session in 3 weeks. He was not there to deliver good news. He stood at the podium, and he gave them the numbers plainly, because there was no way to make the numbers sound like anything other than what they were. 31 dreadnoughts lost at Callaway, 14 relay stations destroyed or disabled, 9 supply depots raided, communication failures across 11 regional sectors, 3 subject species showing signs of organized uncooperation, a Terran fleet whose full size was still not confirmed, operating in ways that could not be predicted. The room was very quiet. The military chairman stood up when Vralketh finished. "We have assembled a fleet," he said. 300 warships, the largest battle group in Ascendancy history. We send it directly to Earth. We end this. "And what about the rest of it?" Vralketh asked. "The relay stations, the supply depots, the Thenari." "One thing at a time," the chairman said. "We destroy Earth. The humans surrender. Everything else resolves itself." Vralketh looked at the chairman for a long moment. "You still think this is a small problem," he said. "It is a small problem," the chairman said. "It is a small species making noise. We will silence them." Vralketh sat down. He did not argue further. He had been doing the math in his head for weeks, and he kept arriving at the same answer. But the Senate wanted the simple solution, the old solution, the one that had always worked before. So the fleet assembled. 300 warships, pulled from across the Ascendancy. The largest single military force the Vrethkai had deployed in 2 centuries. It gathered at the edge of known space like a storm building on the horizon. The commanders were experienced. The ships were powerful. The orders were clear. Go to Sol. Take Earth. End it. Cassidy received the intelligence report about the fleet's assembly on a Thursday evening. He read it slowly, standing at the window of his command ship, looking out at the dark. 300 warships, larger than anything they had faced, coming straight for home. He had been expecting it. He had told his people at Callaway that this was coming. He had spent the weeks since then, making sure that when it arrived, it would find what he wanted it to find. He turned away from the window and pulled up the deployment maps on his table. The Shadow Fleet, the orbital defense upgrades, the positions of the packed ships that Sorvantel had quietly moved into the outer Sol system over the past 2 weeks. The weapon systems that Earth's engineers had spent 30 years designing for exactly this kind of moment. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he called his commanders, all of them, across every ship in every position. "They're coming," he said, "and we are going to let them come all the way in." He paused. "Make sure everyone is ready. This ends at home." The Vrethkai fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on a clear Tuesday morning. 300 warships, the largest battle group in Ascendancy history. They came in a wide formation, precise and orderly, the way the Vrethkai military always operated. Every ship was in its assigned position. Every commander had their orders. The plan was straightforward. Close on Earth, disable its orbital infrastructure, and demand unconditional surrender. If the humans refused, they would burn the surface. It had worked before. It would work now. For the first 4 minutes, nothing happened. The Sol system looked quiet. Sensors showed the usual traffic, civilian ships, orbital stations, the moon. The Vrethkai fleet advanced at a standard approach speed, already beginning targeting calculations on Earth's orbit. Then, the orbital defense grid came online. It lit up all at once, hundreds of weapons platforms that had not appeared on any scan, because they had been built deep inside the rock of asteroids, into the skin of moons, along the hidden undersides of stations that had looked civilian from the outside for decades. They had been assembled piece by piece, over 30 years, by engineers who had been told, quietly and seriously, that they were building something that could never be used until the day it absolutely had to be. That day had arrived. The front line of the Vrethkai fleet ran into the first volley before their commanders understood what was happening. Energy weapons that were significantly more powerful than anything in the Ascendancy's technical estimates for human capability tore through 3 dreadnoughts in the opening seconds. The formation faltered. Ships began turning, adjusting, trying to identify where the fire was coming from and how much of it there was. The answer was, all of it, from everywhere. Cassidy watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Immovable, positioned deep inside the asteroid belt on the system's far flank. He watched the Vrethkai formation break apart in real time on the tactical display, and he did not feel satisfaction. He felt the cold, focused calm that had carried him through the worst days of the Fringe Wars, the kind of calm that lived just on the other side of fear. "Drone wings, release," he said. The drone platforms, positioned silently in the dark for 2 weeks, running on minimum power, waiting, launched their full loads simultaneously. Thousands of unmanned ships flooded the sensor environment of the Vrethkai fleet, overwhelming targeting systems, blocking communications, filling every frequency with noise. In the chaos, Cassidy gave the order the Shadow Fleet had been waiting for. They came out of the dark, from behind, from the deep outer system where they had been hiding since before the Vrethkai fleet arrived. Fast ships and heavy ships, organized in the strike groups that Commander Duran had tested and refined at Callaway. They hit the rear of the Vrethkai formation hard, going for engines first, then weapon systems. At the same moment, on the far flanks, the packed ships arrived. They were not many, a Thenari strike group of 30 ships, 12 vessels from the Dulo Collective, a scattered but determined force of Osean warships that had been gathering in the outer dark for 2 weeks, guided into position by Sarah Vance's network. They were not the most powerful ships in the battle, but they came from the direction the Vrethkai least expected, and they hit at exactly the right moment. The Vrethkai fleet, caught between the orbital grid ahead, the Shadow Fleet behind, and the packed forces on both sides, lost its formation completely. Ships that had been built for coordinated battle group tactics suddenly had no formation to coordinate with. Commanders who had been trained in the careful, methodical style of ascendancy warfare found themselves facing something that had no method they could recognize. The Battle of Saul lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the Vrethkai fleet no longer existed. Some ships were destroyed, a large number were disabled and drifting. A small group had attempted to flee back the way they came, and been intercepted by a reserve force Cassidy had positioned exactly where he calculated they would run. Their commanders transmitted the standard ascendancy signal for ceasefire request. Cassidy looked at the signal on his screen. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he opened a channel to Sarah Vance, who was waiting on a communication ship near the edge of the system. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm watching the feeds." A brief pause. "I'll handle the next part." "I know you will," he said. The Vrethkai Senate's ceasefire request reached the Terran Union within 24 hours. It came with no conditions, no demands, no carefully worded diplomatic framing. It was 3 lines long, and it said in plain language that the Ascendancy was requesting an immediate halt to military operations and the opening of peace negotiations. Vance read it at her desk. She thought about the tithe decree. She thought about the number 1.2 billion. She thought about Sorvantel's face when she had said they fought back, in that quiet room on a neutral station, as if those words were something she had not let herself believe she would ever say. She drafted the response herself, the same way she had drafted the original declaration. No template, no legal language, plain words. The Terran Union would accept a ceasefire, but there would be no negotiation over the terms of peace. There were no terms to negotiate. There was only a list of things that were going to happen, and the Ascendancy was going to agree to all of them. The Compact of Induction was dissolved. All labor transfers under the Tithe Decree were cancelled. Every species currently under Ascendancy labor agreements was to be released immediately and without conditions. The Vrethkai military was to be reduced to a defensive force only. The Galactic Ascendancy, as a governing structure, was to be dissolved and replaced by a new body in which every member species, including the Vrethkai, had an equal voice and equal standing. That new body would be called the Congress of Free Stars. The first session of the Congress met 6 months later. It was held on a neutral station, built specifically for the purpose, assembled by teams from 7 different species, who had spent 3 months working side by side. Some of them meeting each other for the first time, learning each other's languages and habits and ways of doing things, arguing about design choices and making small jokes, and gradually, carefully, beginning to trust. The chamber was large and round, with seating arranged in a circle, so that no one sat at the head of the table. Delegates from 14 species filed in and took their seats. The Vrethkai delegation arrived last. They did not look comfortable, but they were there. Vance stood at the speaker's podium in the center of the room. She had notes. She didn't use them. She looked around the chamber, at the Fenari delegates sitting straight and still, at the Dulo representatives with their heads bowed in the gesture that meant formal respect in their culture, at the Ossian nomads, who had never sat in a room like this in their history, at the humans scattered through the seats and the doorways and the observation galleries above. She looked at the Vrethkai delegation for a moment. Then she looked at everyone else. "We didn't build this room to celebrate what we survived," she said. "We built it because surviving wasn't enough. Surviving just means you're still here. We want something more than that. This is where we start figuring out what more looks like." She stepped back from the podium. The session chair, a Fenari woman who had been nominated by unanimous vote of all species present, called the First Congress of Free Stars to formal order. Sorvan Tel, sitting 3 seats to the left of the Vrethkai delegation, watched the proceedings with her large dark eyes, calm and steady. She had waited 160 years for something like this. She was not going to miss a single moment of it. Somewhere on Earth, a child, who was not yet old enough to understand any of it, was watching the live broadcast with her parents, sitting on the floor of a small apartment with the screen light on her face, asking her mother why all the aliens looked different. Her mother told her that was the whole point. Outside the station, the stars were where they had always been, enormous and old and completely indifferent to the small, stubborn, impossible things that the small creatures below them sometimes managed to do. The Congress was in session. It was, by any measure, a beginning.